Well, the reviews for this episode are already in.
Very distinctive and enjoyable. And Sherlockian.
Well, let me know whenever you want to start. Just, count me down and you'll do the intro and I don't know, we'll just talk, right? Whatever you want. I mean, I'm here to be helpful for once in my life.
Support for I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere comes from listeners like you who support us through Patreon and Substack. Bonus material, thank you gifts, and more await at patreon.com/IHearOfSherlock and at ihearofsherlock.substack.com. And by Dan Andriakos, Sebastian McCabe, Jeff Cody Mystery Series. The latest, Ding Dong the Witch is Dead, starts with an arrow through the heart on Valentine's Day. Now available in paperback or as ebooks from MX Books and Amazon. And now you can enjoy some iHo's swag, mugs, notepads, and oval stickers. Available in our store. Find it at ihearofsherlock.com/merchandise.
I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, episode 329. The Epilogues of Sherlock Holmes.
I hear of Sherlock everywhere since you became a astronomer.
In a world where it's always 1895, it's I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, a podcast for devotees of Mr. Sherlock Holmes, the world's first consulting detective.
I've heard of you before. You're Holmes the meddler, Holmes the busybody, Holmes the Scotland Yard Jack in office.
The game's afoot as we interview authors, editors, creators, and other prominent Sherlockians on various aspects of the great detective in popular culture.
As we go to press, sensational developments have been reported.
So join your hosts, Scott Monty and Bert Walder, as they talk about what's new in the world of Sherlock Holmes.
You couldn't have come at a better time!
I'm Bill Curtis. This is I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere. Now here are your hosts, Scott Monty and Bert Walder.
Thank you, Mr. Bill Curtis. Always a pleasure to have you introducing us. Yes, this is I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, the first podcast for Sherlock Holmes devotees where it's always 1895. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Bert Walder.
And you look like you've been logging a good few hours here.
I have, and it's keeping the axe sharp. That's the difficult part. But typically, after you cut the tree down, you've got to push it into the river. And then it's time for me and my mates to stand around and sing the lumberjack song.
I was going to say, it sounds either like a Monty Python skit or like a setup for a Robert W. Service poem. Something or other.
Well, I'm a lumberjack, and that's okay.
It is. You sleep all night and you work all day.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Yeah. And I know you enjoy scones for tea.
I do.
Buttered scones for tea.
I bake them myself.
Indeed. Well, we are here to bake another episode with you, good folks. We have a wonderful guest, Dr. Bob Katz. He is making a solo appearance here this time. What we're in for? Well, we can only imagine, but we can guarantee that it's going to be some excellent storytelling. In the meantime, we do have a segment called The Learned Societies. We'll review with you some of the upcoming Sherlockian activities that are going on out and about, where you can get involved both locally as well as virtually for those that want to connect via computer. And we will also have the latest entry in our Examining the Pictures segment. It's a film review done by Christian Mongard from Denmark. He's a professional film critic, so we do appreciate his contribution to the genre here. Which film will he be reviewing? Well, if you check the show notes, it's in there, but otherwise we'll leave it as a mystery. And of course, we have the canonical couplet. We give you 2 lines of poetry and ask you to identify the Sherlock Holmes story we are talking about. and we have a prize as a result. So in this case, we will be pulling something interesting and unique from the iHose vaults. Don't know exactly what it'll be, but it'll be worth participating in. And stay tuned because we have the results from last episode's quiz. That's all coming up after the interview. If you'd like to support the show here, of course, you can do so by becoming a patron on Patreon or a subscriber on Substack. You have the option of picking which platform works for you. But for as little as $1 a month, you can say that you are a supporter of I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere. We also have a merch store if you'd like to get iHose merchandise. We have notepads. We have mugs with the iHose logo on it. You might want to check that out. Also in the show notes. And don't forget to patronize our sponsor. You'll hear more about Dan Andriaco's latest work in our ad break. So make sure you pay attention to that and show Dan some love. Well, we seem to be marching, according to that stately music, into the next month. It is, my goodness, we are now in May. Bert, where might we and other interested and active Sherlockians find themselves in the month of May?
Well, you and I are going to find ourselves in Boston, Massachusetts, with plenty of other happy Sherlockians on May 1st at the annual dinner meeting of the Speckled Band of Boston. And George Schwartz is the contact for that and can tell you more. That's an invitation-only event, but there is a list of non-members that are invited. And those invitations, I think, are going out shortly.
Yeah. All the steak and kidney pie you care to eat.
And a little bit more.
I'll tell you how much I care to eat. The crew of the Bark Lone Star has their monthly meeting on May 3rd. That's a Sunday. And it's a virtual meeting. You can find out more at dfw-sherlock.org.
And also on May 3rd, the Tea Brokers of Mincing Lane are having a virtual meeting run by our friend Karen Ellery. So get your pot out, boil the kettle, get the kettle moving, and join the Tea Brokers on May 3rd.
And on Tuesday, May 5th, you can join the Stormy Petrels for a study session in Vancouver, British Columbia. Sheldon Goldfarb is your contact there. You can find them at thestormypetrels.com.
And May 6th is a Wednesday, and that means it's time for the Ash Wednesday dinner, always the first Wednesday of a month in New York City. Contact Shana Carter to find out more.
And if you're not in New York City on the 6th, you can join a virtual meeting of the Transfixed Correspondence of Phoenix. Lauren Sircone is your contact there.
And we will then I'll certainly be on May 8th in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, at the dinner meeting of the Sons of the Copper Beaches. That is also an invitation-only event. I really look forward to that. And Mary Alcaro can tell you more. There are always a few invitations that go to non-members, so if you're interested, contact Mary.
On May 9th, the Shaka Sherlockians of Hawaii will be hosting their latest virtual meeting. Joe Page is your contact there. You can find them at shakasherlockian.com.
And May 9th, the Sespudlians of London, Ontario are having a virtual meeting. Ian Bennett can tell you more, and you can check out their website at sespudlians.weebly.com.
And also on the 9th, an in-person meeting in St. Louis, Missouri. The Parallel Case is having a story discussion. You can find them at parallelcasestl.wixsite.com. Rob Nunn is your contact.
And on the 15th of May, St. Charles, Missouri, we'll see the Harpooners of the Sea Unicorn having an in-person meeting. Jonathan Basford is your contact, and you can find out more on their website, harpooners.wordpress.com.
And you can find all of these events and more at SherlockianCalendar.com. If you'd like to add your own, get in touch with Ron Fish. There, his email address is on the website. Robert Katz graduated from Haverford College and the Albert Einstein College of Medicine and specialized in pathology when he was practicing. He was co-publisher of the Baker Street Irregulars Press once upon a time and founder of the Epilogues of Sherlock Holmes, which we are about to hear about in this very episode. He's headmastiff emeritus of the Sons of the Copper Beeches, a member of the Adventuresses of Sherlock Holmes, serves as Cartwright in the Baker Street Irregulars, and holds the 2 Shilling Award. He's co-edited a number of books for the Baker Street Irregulars Press, including The Wrong Passage, Irregular Stain, Nerve and Knowledge, Trenches, and Stimulating Medicine. He is a multiple episode guest here on I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, and we are delighted to welcome him back to the show. Bob Katz, welcome back once again to I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere.
Thank you. It's always a lot of fun to be with you guys.
Well, we aim to keep that string going. So, and you actually have the distinction of being the only third-party guest we've had on Trifles, believe it or not.
Oh yeah.
We talked about Watson appearing in the Civil War.
Yes, my favorite topic.
My goodness, there's so much to cover with you. But so this particular episode, where we're talking about the epilogues of Sherlock Holmes. This is part of our series where we look at Sherlockian scion societies. And the epilogues, they're not one of these, kind of ancient and august societies that goes back to the 1940s, but it does go back quite a bit. And there's a bit of a resurrection involved. So why don't we at least start at the beginning? You and Bert were discussing this before we started the show. Tell us about the beginnings of the epilogues of Sherlock Holmes.
First of all, it's great to be here, and I appreciate your inviting me again. In spite of the fact that I've been on several times, you still welcome me back, which shows the lack of judgment that you two guys have.
Always.
Anyway,
yes.
Anyway, in 1987, my wife and I moved from Baltimore to Morristown, New Jersey, where I still am. I joined the pathology group at our local hospital, the Morristown Medical Center, and my wife opened her own gynecology practice. And between 1987 and mid-1990, we were both busy, very busy with our practices, and we had 2 small children by then. And I know both of you are parents and you have careers, and you know what a busy time that is. In my case, even though I wasn't by mid-1990, even though I wasn't yet 40 years old, I'd been active in Sherlockian societies for probably 20 years. And being as busy as I was, though, it was really just very difficult, almost impossible for me to go to Sherlockian events. Family, being on call, work, the usual obligations at that time of life. And of course, I missed being at Sherlockian events. It's something that's always given me great pleasure. I love to be in science. And by 1990, I'd become close friends with Tom Stix, who lived about 40 minutes from here in New Jersey and was the Wiggins of the Baker Street Irregulars. And I went through my usual kind of, whiny lament about how I miss being at science societies. And Tom, in his usual gravelly, gruff, and utterly direct way, says, "Start your own." And I said, "Really?" And he said, "Start your own." Okay. So I remember that in the late 1980s, while I was still in Baltimore, I served a 2-year term as gas agent of the 6 Napoleons of Baltimore. And because it's not always easy to get speakers, I decided that what we would do at our meetings is not only would we take a quiz on the story, but we'd actually spend 15 or 20 minutes talking about it, which was initially viewed as some form of heresy. But after a little while, everybody kind of liked it. So, because in all truthfulness, I really didn't have a lot of time to prepare things for meetings and get speakers, I said to myself, all right, we'll start a scion and we'll do a discussion. And because I went to a Quaker college, I've always been acquainted with local Quakers who are wonderful people. And in our area, there's a Quaker meeting house. And because of the nature of Quaker worship, most of which takes place in silence, but every now and then people are moved to speak, the acoustics of Quaker meeting houses are wonderful. And the layout of at least this particular meeting house was fabulous. There were 4 banks of 3 benches facing each other in sort of a square and with an open space in the middle. So basically, wherever you sat, you could see the people in the 3 other banks of benches. And they also had an all-purpose room next door where you could eat. And I said, okay, I'm gonna start the scion. The folks at the Quaker meeting were very kind and allowed us to use their facility at a very attractive rent. And I decided I'd start a scion. And of course, I had to have a name for it. And I looked through all the various lists that people like Peter Blau were maintaining. And I really wanted to find something that nobody else had used before. And there weren't too many left. But I fixated on the title, The Epilogues of Sherlock Holmes, which most of you know is the subtitle of his last bow, which is an epilogue of Sherlock Holmes. An epilogue implies something that follows, and we all follow Sherlock Holmes. So what I did is obtain the meeting house. It was September of 1990, and sent out notices to basically everybody I knew within, 2,000-mile radius of Chatham, New Jersey, where the meeting house was located. And I arranged with a local deli to deliver a 6-foot sub. And because you can't smoke or drink alcohol in a Quaker meeting house, the sub was delivered, and I brought a couple of cases of canned soda and several bags of potato chips, and was able to charge very little money because there weren't exactly any frills. And we had our first meeting, and I think we had about 20 odd people, including Tom Stix, who handed me an official notification that we were now an official science society of the Baker Street Irregulars, which was great because until that point, we never even had a meeting. But I thought that was pretty cool. And we sat initially in the all-purpose room and ate and drank soda. And I picked his last bow to discuss, which of course is typical of me, starting at the end rather than the beginning. But for reasons which I'll mention in a few moments, there are wonderful echoes in his last bow of the rest of the canon. And it's a surprisingly good way to start. And I'll get back to that in a little while. But we met for, a couple of hours and had a really nice discussion. And everybody agreed that we'd meet again in 3 or 4 months, which we did. And I think that second meeting, we also picked, I picked one story. And again, it went well. It may have been The Hound. I can't recall for sure, but it doesn't matter. But after that second meeting, I realized that it's kind of hard to sustain 2 hours conversation on one story. So I think it was our third meeting. I just said, all right, I'm going to pick 2 stories and we'll discuss one and then the other. So I picked 2 stories, and basically I just picked 2 stories that I hadn't read in a while. That was it. There was no other forethought to doing this. And we got together, and by then we decided we'd hold the we'd eat in the all-purpose room, and then we'd meet in the the worship room, which was, as I said, had these wonderful acoustics, and the seating was great because if I sat in one bench and everybody else was in the other three rows, I could see everybody and everybody could see everybody else. And we had a really good discussion about two stories. We discussed one and then the other. We had a lot of people at the time I met through the Quaker meeting, and they had not read the stories before. So I would open those meetings by saying, okay, who read the story for the first time? And I asked them for their impressions of the story. And, most of us were so jaded by then that we didn't have anything new to say. But these folks came to the stories with fresh eyes, and they had wonderful things to say. And we went through that first meeting with two stories, and everything went well. And I was about to wrap it up when the late, great Warren Randall, whom many of you remember from Long Island, said, well, Bob, what's the link between the stories? And I said, Warren, what do you mean by a link? And he said, well, why'd you pick these two stories? And frankly, I was too embarrassed to say, I don't know, I just picked them out of thin air because I felt like talking about them. So on the spot, having been on the debating team when I was in high school, you become very good at lying very quickly. I just made up some kind of connection between the two, figuring that everybody would just laugh at me, and then we'd go home. Well, I made up this link, and people actually took it seriously. And we went for another 20 minutes with the group coming up with their own interrelationships and links between these two stories that were far more intelligent than anything I had just made up on the spur of the moment. So that became our tradition, our format going forward is we do two stories. We'd start with, this informal dinner, and then repair to the meeting room, and we talk about two stories. And I think the next time I made it easy for myself, and I picked like Final Problem and Empty House, but that was too easy, and people bawled me out about that. So I would, for the next almost 30 years, attempt to pick stories that had no obvious relationship to each other, and try to think of relationships. And the group would always come like ready to think about relationships between the two stories. And there was some marvelous ideas that came out of it. And I really learned over the decades that this what I made up the pretentious term of the organic unity of the canon, which is one of these, literary criticism terms that you hear in college and don't really mean much, but they sound erudite. But you realize that there's a surprising amount of structure to the canon. And we kept going. And for our 5th anniversary, and I'll get back to some other issues, we went back to His Last Bow, but I added a study in Scarlet. And if what's interesting is most of us, when we read the canon, we'll start with Study in Scarlet, and then however long it takes to get to the end is when, you read His Last Bow. But if you read the two one right after the other, there are amazing, what I like to call foreshadows in A Study in Scarlet that link to His Last Bow. And if you read His Last Bow, you realize that there are echoes going all the way back to Study in Scarlet. So it's a really cool juxtaposition. And at every one of our 5th anniversaries, 5, 10, 15, et cetera, we go back to Study in Scarlet and His Last Bow. We started to get some, we had a wonderful membership. Bert was at the early meetings, and then as he mentioned to me before we got on, he went to Europe for a few years, but came back. Tom and Dorothy Sticks, Bob and Terry Tomlin, people from Westchester like Richard Ween and Cynthia, Warren Randall, Joe Fink, Joe Moran. These are all people who are gone, but we had a lot of other people who are thankfully still very much with us. One of the things that my wife had suggested was that we try to keep this informal and inexpensive. And that's why we had the 6-foot sub, and I'll get to ice cream in a moment. But her point was that we wanted to keep the price low enough that pretty much anybody could afford to attend. And if they couldn't afford to attend, they could come anyway, and we could absorb the loss. And I remember there was one member who's long gone, but a wonderful chatty lady from New York, and she never had any money, but she was a real character. I won't mention her name, but if I did, everybody would know who she was. She passed away several years ago. She never had any money, so she'd always say, "Bob, I'm coming to the dinner, and I'll pay you when I get there." And she never paid me when she got there, but she would very surreptitiously put 4 inches of the 6-foot sub into her purse and a couple of cans of soda. And that was like her meals for the rest of the week. And it was I always just looked the other way because I was just glad we could do something for her. So we did that. We had a lot of people who were new to the Sherlockian world who eventually became active. And then we had some really, really remarkable things that happened at the meeting that you only can get if you're this informal. And I used to say, people would say, well, I was the moderator or the chairman or whatever. I used to say I was just a traffic cop because the whole goal of the meeting was for everybody else to talk. And I really would just try to say something, provocative or prodding to get everybody going. And then it really took off on its own. And we'd actually go for 2.5 hours with a quick break in the middle with really no lulls in the conversation. But we had some amazing moments. Once we did, when we did the Greek interpreter, you remember there's a section in the Greek interpreter where, Melas is talking to the prisoner, and there are a couple of lines in Greek. And one of the people that was at that meeting was the wife of a Philadelphia Sherlockian, and her name was Athena. So she was Greek American. And during the meeting, I had her get up and read in Greek those Greek sentences.
Oh, wow.
And, I'd never heard them read in Greek. So that was really cool. It was a very unique kind of experience. As we really got familiar with the format and everybody kind of was into it, Susan Rice and Mickey Fromkin would come out from New York on the train, and I'd meet them at the station and drive them over. And Susan, at the end of one meeting, I asked for, what I would often do is ask for a suggestion for one story, and then I'd pick the other, which was intentionally as unrelated to the first as I could make it. And Susan said, well, Bob, how about if we pick both stories? And I said, well, okay, why not? And then Susan, with her usual impishness, said, and we don't tell you what the stories are. And I said, what do you mean? And she said, well, we'll all get together with Peter McIntyre, and I'll bring him up in a moment, who was by then actively participating in running things. We'll all tell Peter our choices. And Peter, who was sending out the invitations, will go through them, and he'll pick the two stories that seem to be the most popular choices. And he'll send all of us an invitation telling us what the two stories are, but we won't send the invitation to you. And when you get here, we're still not going to tell you what the stories are. And I said, you mean we're going to play 20 questions? And she said, yeah. So now I'm really in a pickle because I had to agree to it. And they picked the two stories, and I show up at the meeting. But what I did is something that I learned from moderating a lot of these meetings is that the openings of the Sherlockian canon stories are very important. They're often the best part of the story. And you learn all sorts of really cool stuff. So what I did was I read the first page of each of the 60 stories to prepare. And I was allowed to ask questions. And eventually, somehow, I figured out what the two stories were. And then, without really knowing much, any preparation besides reading 60 pages of, one page of each entry in the canon, we went ahead and discussed it, and thank goodness everybody else was well prepared. So we had a great time, and that was really fun. That was really fun. In the late 90s, so the group was going along very well, but in the late 90s, life really hit the fan for me, and my wife became terribly ill and then died in 1998, and I had by then 3 small children to raise, and it was just horrible. There's no way around it. And running the epilogues, but at that point I was sending out the invitations, making the room arrangements, getting the food, all that stuff, and it just became too much for me. And we met somewhat less frequently. We'd really been meeting about 4 times a year until then, and it kind of petered out and became a problem. And then really in one of the great, I think, unselfish moments in my own now half-century Sherlockian journey, Peter McIntyre, who'd been an active member of the group and lives about an hour away from me here in New Jersey, said, Bob, I don't want this group to die. I'll take care of the administration and the food and all that stuff. And Peter's a good cook. And I said, well, gee, that's great. If you're going to do all that work, you can moderate the meetings. So I have this kind of rule: if you do the work, you make the rules. And he said, no, that's okay. You can moderate them. I'll just do the other stuff. And for really close to 20 years, Peter sent out the invitations. He booked the room. He got the 6-foot sub. But we also learned that Peter, other than being a very organized guy, was a very good cook. He'd bring stuff like homemade shrimp and stuff, salads, but he also made ice cream, homemade ice cream. Ooh. And Bert, you've had it. I got to say, it may be the best ice cream I've ever had. What do you think?
Oh, I very much agree. Yeah, I mean, that's, this is a constant story of these unexpected gems, and one of the bright unexpected sparks is discovering that, Peter is a world-class ice cream maker. And everyone was, the people would show up, and it was always the same, as you say, the chips and the 6-foot sub and so on. But immediately you'd take your coat off, come in, say hello, and then everyone wanted to know, Peter, what's the ice cream? What ice cream have you brought today?
Yeah, because he'd make different flavors. And Peter's also a master gardener. So I remember once he made peach ice cream, and he'd grown the peaches. I mean, this was incredible. So we became famous for having a discussion and this amazing ice cream, which to this day, everybody, when we went on hiatus, because near the end, I'll talk about a revival, which is very recent. But I don't think anybody, when we went on hiatus, I don't think anybody cared, that they weren't hearing what I had to say. But boy, everybody missed that ice cream because it was amazing. And his wife, Joan, was always very helpful with that. So at that point, Peter really took over the administrative stuff, and I kept doing the discussions, and we had some other really cool events. I decided early on that we'd only do the canon. And we just and Ira Matetsky, who started coming, figured out that there were 7 billion permutations of, pairings of the stories in the canon. So that was never a problem. But every now and then somebody would say, well, can we do a pastiche? And I'd say, no, it's not canonical. Well, eventually, when I came to one meeting and people were there with burning torches and placards and stuff, we want to do a pastiche. I gave in. And one meeting we did the 7% solution, because if you're going to do a pastiche, do the 7%.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the sign of 4. And it was a great discussion. And Bert, as I recollect, you recorded it and sent it to Nick Meyer. Is that right?
I did, yeah. I was telling Nick about it. And he was fascinated and said, yes. I never heard from him after. I never found out what he thought of the recording, but I did it very discreetly so nobody knew it was being recorded because it was just for Nick. And it was a wonderful discussion. And the links between sine of 4 and the 7% solution are really, really interesting. And, I still hold that in my memory as certainly one of the top Sherlockian discussions. Forget about scion meetings, but one of the top Sherlockian discussions I've ever been a part of.
Oh, it was amazing. Now, in addition to the enormous amount of money that you guys are going to pay me for doing this gig today, right? Check us
enough to
mail.
buy a 6-foot sub.
Right? Yeah, not these days. But Bert, maybe you'll email Nick and ask him if he remembers listening to it. 20 years later, you can tell us what he thought about it if he remembers. That'd be really fun.
Good idea. Yeah. I'll send him a note.
You still have that recording, Bert?
Oh, I'm sure I do. I'll have to find it. It must be on my computer. Yeah.
No, it was an incredible meeting. One meeting, people kept asking me, like, why aren't we doing the Three Gables or the Veiled Lodger? And the answer is kind of apparent that most people don't like them. But eventually the crescendo built. And I broke down and the only time we did a trilogy of stories instead of a duet, we did a trilogy and it was billed as Bad Story Night. And I recollect that we did Veiled Lodger, Three Gables, and the Mazarin Stone. And interestingly, when you put them all together and you got a really bright group of people present, and, in those days, Joe Fink would come and you never knew what Joe was going to say, except that it was going to be outrageous, which was great. I mean, Joe was just the most off the wall guy, and he was wonderful and extremely smart. And he was always a great fan. He thought that the unheralded hero of the canon was the snake in Speckled Band. So we did Bad Story Night, and everybody said, these really aren't that bad if you talked about them all together. And then at a subsequent meeting, I just picked Wisteria Lodge. And oddly enough, nobody complained about doing like Three Gables. For some reason afterwards, people said, don't do Wisteria Lodge again. And at all the events I'd been to since then, I didn't talk about Wisteria Lodge. Only very recently when I was doing a discussion with the crew of the Bark Lone Star, we do the whole canon in succession. We had to do Wisteria Lodge, and I hadn't read it in like 15 years. And actually, it's kind of a cool story. But that was the one that I was told not to do.
As Bob pauses here to gather his thoughts, we're going to pause and have a brief word from our sponsor.
Sherlockian, magician, mystery writer, professor, and sleuth at large. That's Sebastian McCabe. In a series of lighthearted mysteries by Dan Andriacco, Mac calls on his knowledge of the great detective to solve conundrums in his small town of Erin, Ohio. These adventures are shared and chronicled by Mac's brother-in-law, Jeff Cody, an admiring but by no means uncritical Watson. Readers say the cast of continuing characters, including Jeff's journalist-turned-novelist wife Linda, makes each new book feel like a visit home again. The McCabe and Cody mysteries are packed with Easter eggs for Sherlockians, but they also feature engaging characters, good writing, solid plotting, and a light touch. As Bonnie McBird said, "You're in the hands of a master of mystery plotting here." David Markham calls the series classic Golden Age mysteries set now. The latest in the series, Ding Dong, the Witch is Dead, starts with an arrow through the heart on Valentine's Day, and that's not even the main mystery. Dan Andriacco's McCabe and Cody mysteries are available in paperback or as ebooks from MX Books and Amazon.
Let's see, what else? Oh, one day we were meeting.
Hey, just one second here, Bert. This is the best interview because we don't even have to ask questions.
Yeah, good. Well, so be quiet.
Go.
Keep going, Bob.
A carefully prepared script. Actually, I'm not actually talking. This is all AI generated. Yeah, this is like, open AI or whatever. Now, one meeting we had, I thought it was an amazing event. We all got together in the meeting room, and there was this huge thunderstorm. I don't know if you were there, Bert. There was a huge thunderstorm.
Yeah, I was. I remember that.
And a tree fell during the course of the meeting. A tree fell and blocked the driveway opening to the meeting house. So all of us were now stuck. But we're all like standing out there. How many Sherlockians does it take to move a tree? And we're all like totally useless. But there was one member, I won't mention her name just as I don't know if she is a matter of privacy, but it was a tall, athletic young woman. And a neighbor saw this and came out and gave us a hand saw. And this young lady stood on the tree. And fortunately, it wasn't like an oak tree with like a 4-foot trunk. It was just dogwood or something, but it was enough to block it. She stood on the tree and with the hand saw just sawed off the tree. And then when it was sawed off, all of us got together and picked up the tree and pushed it aside, and we were able to go home. And somewhere I've got a photograph of this gal standing on the tree with a saw in her hand. And it was kind of like Wonder Woman becomes a lumberjack. I mean, it was great. So the group continued, and we just had wonderful people cycling through the group. I've mentioned several people who passed away, but we also had people like Charlie and Joan Blankstein, Margaret Flesack from Westchester, again, the late Bud Livingston, who was the only other person in the Sherlockian world other than Terry Hunt, who also came to our meetings, who would tolerate my talking about the American Civil War at inappropriate moments discussing the canon. It was just, and we just had other people who were local who really only came to the epilogues, but just became very, very knowledgeable and brought a lot of wisdom. So this went on for 28 years till 2018. In late 17 was a tough year for me. My mother, who had been living with us after my father passed away, my mother had been living with us, became quite quickly, senile or demented and physically very unwell. And she died at the very end of 2017. By then, my kids were grown, but it was a great loss because she stepped in when my wife died and spent nearly 20 years helping me to raise my sons, which was as I always used to tell her, she did a much better job with them than she did with me, to which she would say, they're much nicer than you are. Which is probably true. Plus, my mother had been an English teacher and a reading teacher and an assistant principal in a New York City junior high school at 4'11". So, you didn't mess around with my mother, and she taught those kids grammar. I mean, my middle son ended up at the Dartmouth writing program, which has turned out people like Mindy Kaling and Shonda Rhimes and the Game of Thrones crew. And as he said, when he got there, grammar and punctuation was not a problem for him. And I said, well, that's your grandmother gets the credit for that. But anyway, 2017 was a tough year. And by the time we got to 2018, I'd been doing this 4 times a year for 28 years. That's, close to, even with some gaps, it's close to 100 meetings, 2.5 hours each time. I just started to get tired. I talked with Peter and I said, gee, do you want somebody else to start moderating the discussions? And he said, no, you and I have become so comfortable working together. If we're going to stop, we're going to stop. So we took, we just said, all right, we're shutting down, or maybe we said we were on hiatus. I don't remember. And it really was in a way lovely how many wonderful emails we got about how much people like the group. I'll comment in the modern era that we did have several women who came on their own, and all of them commented to me that they felt safe, which I'm very proud of, particularly in this era when issues of inappropriate behavior are very much in the news. I was very happy to learn that we had a lot of these very smart women who joined us and just felt comfortable being there. Even though I said I was the traffic cop, we never really had an argument. Bert, do you remember? It never got out of hand. I mean, even we encouraged disagreement, and people always disagreed, which was great because that brings, sheds light on things. But we never had what I would call an argument.
I think we had some very vigorous discussions, but no, well, there isn't really a tremendous amount of. I mean, it's not, it's not like sports, Unfortunately, politics and so many other things are now winners and losers, and who's going to win this and who's going to win that. But that's the Sherlockian world is a good distance away from that sort of conflict-oriented, this is right and everybody else is wrong kind of environment.
Yeah, and that just worked very well. So in 2018, we announced that we were going to take a break or end it, whatever. And about a year later, in late 2019, Ira Matetsky in New York and Peter McIntyre said to me, "Well, Bob, how about if we start it up again and we'll help you out." Peter would do his usual role of being the administrator and the chef, and Ira said, I'll if you're tired of doing 4 meetings a year, I'll moderate whenever you want me to and give you a little break. And in early 2020, they actually went ahead and we booked the Quaker Meeting House for 2 meetings in 2020. This was like February. And then, as you all remember, in March of 2020, the world stopped because we had COVID. And that ended that as far as those meetings were concerned. And by the time we got to really 2022 or early 2023, we did look into starting things up again, but the meeting house really had changed a lot of its rules. We would have had to get insurance, which would have been the price, put the cost of attendance, which I think even at the last meeting in 2018, we were charging $10, and for that you got what Peter Blau called the best sandwich he's ever had, the best ice cream anybody's ever had, a can of soda, and a cabaret for $10. But it would have pushed the cost up, and Bert knows the series.
I'm curious about the insurance part. I mean, I can't imagine a lot happening with people under the power of sandwiches and soda. But are Quakers known to be litigious?
Well, there are a lot of good Quaker lawyers. I mean, I even know some, and I guess the issue was if somebody fell, or had a medical event during the evening, there was an issue of liability.
Yeah.
What can I tell you? This is what they said, and that's just the way it was. And Bert knows this general area. There really aren't other places, and I did look, that are suitable for that kind of format. There are places that if you want to have a rather more typical Sherlockian meeting with dinner and a speaker and a quiz, you can come up with that. But to a very surprising extent, and I think Bert will agree with me, the physical structure of the room, the physical layout, and the acoustics to a great deal shaped the format of the meeting. In that, I would sit in one seat and I could see everybody and everybody could see each other. And, even if somebody was sitting in the back row and mumbled, you could hear everything they said. And we just couldn't find a place that could reproduce that. So between, like 2023 and last week, it just languished. I mean, there was nothing I could do. During that period, though, in COVID, I did have the happy involvement, began a happy involvement with an online group, the Crew of the Bark Lone Star, which used to meet in person out of Dallas, Texas, and was founded by people like way back by people like Francine Swift and Bill Beeson, and eventually run by people like Don Hobbs and Jim Webb, and then more recently Steve Mason and Cindy Brown. And I'd never been a big fan of online meetings, but some point during COVID, the late, great Russell Merritt emailed me and said, Bob, I'm going to speak at this group called the Crew of the Bark Lone Star. And you two remember Russell. It's just worth, if Russell read from the phone book, it would be interesting. So I tuned into this meeting, and it was really well run. I mean, Steve Mason just does a really good job keeping it going. And it went for 2 hours, and it didn't lag. And part of it was they had a 20-minute discussion of the story. And whoever moderated it did a nice job. And then I came back, and they meet monthly. And I came back the next month, and somebody else moderated the story and did a nice job. And I said afterwards to Steve, well, he asked for a volunteer. I said, well, I'll moderate the next story. And he said, okay. And I don't know what happened, but 5 years later, I'm still moderating the story every month. But for me, as a learning experience, I became quite comfortable moderating this, and it's only 20 minutes, but moderating a Sherlockian story online. And you two guys are very experienced public speakers. And you know that when you're speaking to a live audience, there are certain tricks that you learn, like body language, the people in the room, and you could hear guffaws, and you make eye contact. That's very important. And, Scott, you teach marketing and presentations. I suspect you probably teach some of those, I'll call them tricks, but they're really lessons, which you don't get when you're online and everybody looks like a postage stamp. But over the years, I became comfortable with doing this. And last week, I was, the virtues of being snowed in. We're just getting over the second of two humongous snowstorms. And my son Alex missed the storm by being out of town, and my other two sons were in Manhattan. And I got snowed in, and fortunately we didn't lose power. But, the worst part of being snowed in for like 72 hours is boredom. And I suddenly had the idea that, gee, maybe we could revive the epilogues as a virtual group. So I got in touch with Steve Mason, who not only does a terrific job running the Crew of the Bark Lone Star, but he and I have done many interviews for the BSI Oral History Project. And I'll do some of the interviewing, and Steve runs the Zoom. And so we've become very close friends and just work together on an immense amount of stuff. And I said to Steve, would you be willing to do the Zoom for like a 1 hour meeting of the epilogues? And we'd meet maybe 4 times a year online. And he said, yeah, sure, I'll help you out. So it just, in the course of a day, it just kind of spiraled. I contacted Peter Blau and Steve Doyle and Mike McSwiggan, who kind of oversee science societies, and asked if we could return from inactive status to active. And we're going to have our first online meeting the Sunday of Memorial Day weekend. And we're not going to, we'll start publicizing it at the April Crew of the Bark Lone Star, because they've got like 350 people on their mailing list. We're not going to invite all of them, but and I'll perhaps post, Scott, if it's okay with you, in the strangers room, how to get in touch. I even set up an email address just for the epilogues, and
we can even share it right here in the show notes.
Yeah.
Well, not yet.
Not yet. All right, stay tuned, folks.
We're not, the meeting's at the end of May, so I want to work out the time and that kind of stuff. But we'll get back to you. And as I said, maybe we'll post it if it's okay with you in Strangers Room. But we'll meet for an hour, and we're going to do the usual epilogues format, which is we'll discuss one story for a while, we'll discuss a second, and then we'll try to come up with linkages between the two. And we will start. What I will say, you can put in the show notes, that tradition regained. The first two stories we will discuss will be A Study in Scarlet and His Last Bound, because they just pair together so nicely. So that's what we'll do. I got to say, I'm really enthusiastic about this. I work with Steve a lot, and between us and with the crew of the Bark Lone Star, I've actually become comfortable with moderating a Zoom discussion. It does work. Takes some experience, but thankfully I got that. And Bert, I'm going to ask you maybe to comment, but I just had a wonderful experience chairing these meetings, because not only did I get to meet and hear from a lot of bright people, but I can truly say, I've been an active Sherlockian for more than 50 years, and I think I learned more insights about Sherlock Holmes by just listening to what people at the Epilogues had to say than I did by reading, all sorts of learned commentaries. I just wonder what you thought, Bert.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's very well said. I mean, I would say two things about that. One is about you. I think that our listeners can tell, that you are amazingly articulate. You have great recall, great memory, and you're known in the Sherlockian world as sort of the master of the no notes paper. I mean, you have the sort of mind that, if somebody asks you to talk about a topic, you can sort of structure it in about 4 seconds in your mind and go from point to point to point to point. And it's fascinating. And so you're the perfect person to be doing this, because that's really the secret sauce. But the second thing about the people, the real thing about the Sherlockian world is exactly that. The minds, the personalities, the characters, the experiences, the points of view of all of us. And during my time as a Sherlockian, which is roughly around the same as yours, the best things I've done are the result of talking to other people, asking what they thought. When you search for topics for meetings, when you think about writing a Sherlockian article, when you're looking for people to recruit to write essays, the best things, the most successful experiences I've had has been tapping the minds of others and asking them, hey, what do you think? And what would you do if? And that's, I think it's an unlooked for aspect of success and collaboration that, and many people, and I'm sure Scott encounters this in his consulting work too. The problem with many of the people who are running organizations today is that they don't have colleagues. You can't really, if you're the CEO of some big business or even a small business, there's no real person you can go into their office and say, hey, I'm a little uncertain about this. What do you think? But this is the environment that makes that really possible. So, yeah, I mean, it's like mining for gold in talking to other Sherlockians.
Yeah, I would concur on that. And the thing is, every time we do an interview here on I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, we learn something. We get a different perspective. We find out something new. When you're doing that in a group setting, I think the dynamic that is formed, and it's all set by the leader. When you're inquisitive, when you just kind of set the tone or start with a question and boom, you're off and running. The group, if it's well selected and if everyone feels like they have an equal seat at the table, the group almost runs itself, or the discussion almost runs itself. And that's where I think there is so much to be gained, is by observing, watching, and as you say, Bob, listening. And For as much as we love the Katz monologue, there is so much, Bob, about you that I can tell when I talk with you on any given occasion that you take in an awful lot and you learn an awful lot and you process it and you present things in a way that makes more people want to contribute. And that's a talent.
Yeah. Well, the wonderful thing about, not to embarrass Bob, but the wonderful thing about an Epilogues meeting, and I've said this to a lot of other people, is that Bob has an amazingly inconvenient memory. And so the best part of the Epilogues meeting to me always was the start, when Bob would stand up and say, okay, so today we're going to be talking about insert story name here. And he'll look around at the group and he'll say, help me out here. How does this start? and 2 hours later, you've had a great meeting,
Well, you're both very kind, and I appreciate the compliment. So, because we're amongst friends, I'm going to you'll indulge me to tell a personal story, which I've never told before.
Oh, good.
And you've heard most of my stories. When I was in high school, which was a shattering experience, and started ninth grade, it was a private school. And the headmaster was perhaps the most intellectually rigid person I've ever met in a lengthy academic career in college, medicine, you name it. And they had a policy that the boys had to be on a team. And this was before Title VII, so when women could do sports. So the boys had to be on a team. And I'm like the most unathletic person imaginable. My parents thought it was a miracle that I actually got an honors grade in surgery when I was in medical school. And if you can believe it, I was offered a spot in the cardiac surgery program at a major hospital in New York City, which is a frightening thought. But anyway, so I was totally unathletic, and I just, wasn't going to play basketball. I was short. And so the headmaster, at the end of 8th grade tells my parents, well, Bob's not going to function on a team, so we have to expel him. And it's like, you mean I'm getting expelled from high school because I can't, shoot a basket? And my parents, when they said, did you look at his grades? Oh, no, I didn't. Well, all right. I'm not going to tell you, but you can imagine I may not have been a very good athlete, but I did manage to pass my courses. So they came to a compromise, and the guy was doing me a favor, and he said, all right, Bob, you don't have to be on an athletic team, but basically they're going to exile me to the debating team, which was girls. So for all of high school, I got to be on the debating team where, all the smart girls in the school were on the team. Some of them were really cute. And we would travel up and down the East Coast to go to tournaments many weekends. And the coach was the world's worst chaperone. So I had a great, that was like the only good thing about high school. But one of the things that you get to do on in high school debate is you walk into a room and the judge hands you a slip of paper with a topic, what's the current state of the gross domestic product of Zambia? And you get like 15 seconds and you have to talk for 5 minutes. So eventually you become comfortable speaking about the craziest of things with no notes. So Bert and Scott were very kind to say that, I have this facility to speak without notes and give a monologue. And I owe it to the fact that I'm the world's worst baseball player. And in order to avoid being expelled from high school, I was exiled to the debating team with all the cute, smart girls in our school. So that's the one highlight of my pre-college experience. But I guess it spilled over to the Sherlockian world.
Pretty good.
I love that story. And it's an iHose exclusive.
Yes. Never told this in public.
Yeah.
And somehow 2 of my children became ranked tennis players, which still amazes me. But no, I'm genuinely looking forward to restarting the epilogues. My only regret is that Peter McIntyre, until we invent some type of 3D printer, is not going to be able to serve the ice cream over the internet. But it's something I'm looking forward to, and we will put out registration information in the near future, and I'm just very enthusiastic because it really was one of the wonderful experiences of my Sherlockian journey, and I'm very appreciative to you two for inviting me back and giving me a chance to not only talk about what's to come, but to reminisce about a really lovely part of my past, which I'm glad certainly Bert was able to participate in.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah. Well, we will look forward to when the epilogues officially relaunch online, and we'll make it possible for our listeners to sign up for it. I think what we'll do is we'll put a link in the show notes to a Google form. So we'll collect email addresses for you, Bob, and then we'll share them with you so you can send it out when appropriate. So, folks, if you're interested in being part of this iconic group and witnessing Bob's mastery firsthand, check out the link in the show notes to the Google form, and he will get in touch when things are ready to go.
Yes, we definitely will.
Excellent. Well, Bob, thank you so much for your storytelling and your wonderful reminiscence, and more importantly, for the relaunching of this important initiative.
Thank you. This has been a real pleasure.
I hardly know what to say. I don't need to say anything about the conversation with Bob because it speaks for itself. And I'm glad we had a chance, to talk a little bit about what's special about him. But one of the interesting points I think he made that I don't want to gloss over is not only the acoustics, but the layout of the worship room at the Quaker Meeting House. Because today, when you go to church or you go to most synagogues, what you find is it's kind of like theater seating. There are pews, rows of pews, but all the attention of the room is directed towards the front of the room. And the layout of the worship room at the Quaker Meeting House was that the different sections were all at an angle to the center. And so there was no front of the room. Everyone was pointed facing the center of the room. It's probably hard to describe.
Almost like it almost feels like an operating theater in some ways, I would imagine.
Yeah, you could say that, but everybody was at the same level. And imagine 4 groups of pews, rows behind each other, each one seating, maybe 8-10 people. And imagine 4 of those sections, but each section is pointed so that arranged sort of like a star as you're seating there, everyone is facing the center of the room. So all the attention is at the center of the room. And that had, that waved the wand of equality over everybody in the room. And everybody could see each other. And there was no head table or no, sort of organizer's place. And that really established the right climate for the discussion. It's very freeing.
Yeah, I mean, in many ways, it presaged the eventuality of virtual rooms, where everybody has an equal square on the screen. And, there's one person moderating, but, once you're off and running, everyone has an opportunity to raise a hand or to speak up. So I think it's just an inspired choice. And I love how, even from the earliest days, it was very affordable. And all you need for the future state of the Epilogues of Sherlock Holmes is an internet connection, which you likely already have if you're listening to this show. So, I think everyone will have an opportunity to take part. And it's just wonderful that it's finding some new life in a new format. Well, we're once again pleased to bring you this special feature on our episode. It is from Mr. Christian Mongard, a film critic, and he is taking on yet another Sherlockian film.
Who are we when we can no longer remember, when we are in the process of losing ourselves because our memories are slowly fading? This is one of the questions that Bill Condon poses in his remarkable film Mr. Holmes, which is based on a novel, A Slight Trick of the Mind by Mitch Collin. As the title suggests, the film centers on the master detective Sherlock Holmes, who in 1947, at the age of 93, has long since retired to the countryside to devote himself to his great passion, beekeeping. This is definitely not young Sherlock Holmes, this is old Sherlock Holmes. My name is Christian Mongard. Welcome to Examining the Pictures. For company, the elderly Holmes, played by Ian McKellen, has only his housekeeper, Mrs. Monroe, played by Laura Linney, her bright young son, Roger, played by Milo Parker, and his memories of people and cases which are now beginning to slip away. This is the crux of Mr. Holmes. The detective must solve the mystery of himself, as Bill Condon has put it, and attempt to discover why he left London and the detective profession 3 decades earlier.
I didn't know you wrote stories.
I decided to get it right before I die.
You're not going to die. I had a great uncle who lived to be 102.
What are the odds that you would know 2 men who would live that long?
Well, I didn't actually know him.
Several timelines are woven together gently and elegantly in the film, which begins in the present day, 1947, but also returns to the period just after the First World War and what would become Holmes' final case. But why did he stop? Dr. Watson's published account of the case ends, as usual, with Holmes as the hero. Nevertheless, the detective chose to retire afterwards. Why? What does the now deceased Watson omit in his version of events? In this psychological and memory-driven investigation, Holmes is assisted by Roger, who is fascinated by the brilliant detective and his bees. Roger's mother, an ordinary and not particularly well-educated woman, is not entirely happy about the friendship between the two, but Holmes values having someone in whom he can confide and, not the least, someone to whom he can show the account of his final case that he himself is writing, both as a corrective to Watson's story and as an attempt to remember and, above all, to do justice to those involved. I shall not reveal what truly happened back then, but it is at once moving and deeply dramatic to follow the gradual uncovering of the real events, and it contributes to a rare humanization of the rational, coolly logical detective. It actually poses the question if a detective as brilliant as Holmes can solve the mysteries of the human mind and soul. The film even takes us on a trip to Japan with Holmes in search of a plant that perhaps can help him keep his mind sharp. It is at times rather painful to observe how old Holmes has become in Mr. Holmes. Frail, forgetful, and a shadow of his former most brilliant self. It is rare in film and television to spend time in the company of an elderly Holmes. Yet Ian McKellen succeeds in making his Holmes moving rather than pitiable. He's simply a human being like any other, overtaken by time and age. His intellect still flashes, and he can be just as impatient and arrogant towards, for example, Mrs. Monroe as he once was towards Mrs. Hudson at 221B Baker Street. Holmes' sense of humor also remains intact in the film, for instance in the moments when he explains that he and his friend and chronicler, Dr. Watson, did not in fact live at 221 Baker Street, too many tourists, and complains that Watson's stories and accompanying illustrations influenced people so greatly that in some respects Holmes had to adapt to his own fictional alter ego, including Deerstalker, rather than the other way around. In one amusing scene taking place after World War I, Holmes goes to the cinema to see The Woman in Grey, based on the case that will later haunt him. In that film, which Holmes finds absolutely ridiculous, Holmes is played by Nicholas Rowe, who once played the detective as a boy in young Sherlock Holmes. Mr. Holmes is very much a film about memory and the relationship between brutal reality and comforting fiction, about the positive power of lies and the capacity of logic and truth to wound. It is a theme that Bill Condon and Ian McKellen also explored in their first film together, The Masterful Gods and Monsters, which dealt with the aging film director James Whale and his attempt to rewrite his own painful history. If you haven't seen Gods and Monsters, I urge you to do so. It is wonderful in the same elegantly elegiac way as Mr. Holmes. Condon has made several other entertaining films, Dreamgirls, Chicago, Kinsey, Beauty and the Beast, even 2 of the Twilight films. But Gods and Monsters and Mr. Holmes are his best. Mitch Collins' book and the screenplay by Jeffrey Hatcher make up interesting and fascinating material, which Bill Condon handles with great respect and sensitivity, beautifully framed by Tobias A. Schliessler's atmospheric cinematography, the convincing period detail, and not least Carter Burwell's score, which consistently strikes a melancholic note. Burwell is a master of the beautiful atmospheric score, as witnessed by the music he makes for the films by the Coen brothers. One of my favorite scores of his is for Joel and Ethan Coen's third film, the excellent gangster pastiche Miller's Crossing. You cannot solve everything, Holmes says at one point in Mr. Holmes. Not with regret, but with a certain relief at having reached this liberating realization, even if it comes late in life. Mr. Holmes is also about loss, grief and loneliness, about finding one's place in the world and about bringing one's life to a proper close when one knows there is not much time left. There are things that trouble Holmes, not only unfinished cases, but also the fact that he never said goodbye to Watson, who died some years earlier. That is why it is so important for him to resolve his final case once more, to remember exactly what happened, and find out why the case continues to haunt him. Thank you very much for listening to Examining the Pictures. I'll be back again soon.
Oh, it's wonderful to hear Christian's perspective on that. You know, Bill Condon is a fabulous director, and Jeffrey Hatcher, our friend Jeffrey Hatcher, is a great writer, and they worked together too on The Good Liar in 2019, a wonderful suspense film with Helen Mirren. And Bill Condon is sort of a master at these stories that take a look at how people got the way they are. You know, that's really seems to be a continuing theme through his work. And it's one of the reasons why Mr. Holmes is so enjoyable. Mm.
Well, those delightful strings mean that it's time for everyone's favorite Sherlockian quiz program. That's right, it is Canonical Couplet, where we give you 2 lines of poetry and ask you to try your hand at deciphering which Sherlock Holmes story we're talking about. The last time we were around here, we left you with this clue. You arouse my curiosity, Watson said, at the enigmatic message which left an old man dead. Okay, Bert, here's your chance. Make it happen, Captain.
Yeah. Well, Holmes and Watson frequently attend concerts, and this is one of those cases. But Holmes finds an opera orchestra that an evil stepfather has purposely infected with measles, and the whole case hinges on a bell rope. It's the case Watson called The Freckled Band.
Oh, no, sir. No.
What?
No, I know. Can you believe it? Can you believe I'm refusing you entry on that?
No.
Crazy, I know.
Oh.
Well, as folks have noted, that is not what we are looking for. However, we will turn to our old friend Eric Deckers, who comes through once again. He says, Sugoi! I've solved it. That's Japanese, by the way. It's the story where the father of Sherlock Holmes's friend is visited by an old acquaintance whose appearance causes the father to have a stroke. Holmes's friend is forced to battle for his own survival in a series of video game-style fights against past foes. It's the story Watson called The Adventure of the Glorious Scott Pilgrim versus the World. Except Sherlock Holmes predates most video games, except for Pong. So this is more likely to be the adventure of the Gloria Scott. Yes, Eric, that is what we were looking for. So we will turn to our old pal, the prize wheel, and give it a big spin. Goes around and slowly settles down, landing on 29. 29, that's the one. And it looks like that is Angela Wolfe. Angela, congratulations. We will have a copy of On the Shoulders of Giants for you, so stay tuned for that. Well, now, of course, we turn our attention to this canonical couplet for this episode. We'll have something from the Sherlock Holmes vaults here, the IHO's vaults. If you can guess what it is we're talking about with this clue. To shear one's locks and wear that shade of blue turned out to be a risky thing to do. If you know the answer to this episode's canonical couplet, put it in an email addressed to comment@ihearofsherlock.com with canonical couplet in the subject line. If we choose your name at random from all of the correct entries, you'll win. Good luck. Oh, Bert, I've got a good feeling about this one for you next week.
Yeah, I'm hopeful. I'll have to think about that.
Yeah, hope springs eternal. And spring is right around the corner, so that's entirely appropriate. Though it doesn't feel like... Has February felt particularly long to you?
Well, it certainly has been some cold weather. Yeah, it has been a longish February. Odd, particularly since there are only 28 days.
Right.
What can one do?
It must be that Groundhog Day that they throw in there.
I guess so.
It's on repeat.
That poor groundhog.
Yeah. It must be that Groundhog Day they throw in there. On repeat.
Yeah, that poor groundhog.
It must be that Groundhog Day they throw.
Yeah, that poor groundhog.
We could keep doing this all episode long.
Oh, don't we already?
Yeah, it feels like it. It feels like it. Well, this is the groundhoggingly repetitive Scott Monty.
Oh, that poor groundhog. I'm Bert Wolder.
Together, we say the games of
groundhog.
The games of foot. You know, I'm afraid that in the pleasure of this conversation, I am neglecting business of importance, which awaits me elsewhere.
Thank you for listening. Please be sure to join us again for the next episode of I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, the first podcast dedicated to Sherlock Holmes.
Goodbye, and good luck, and believe me to be, my dear fellow, very sincerely yours, Sherlock Holmes.